So I'm just going to ask you whether you could do the same thing as yesterday. You know, put your phones away and do the daydreaming thing if you want to, but it's my last day, right? So let's try to get through the rest of it. And I'm also a little worried about getting this to the end of the lecture today. So what I would say is, I will set up, so I'm going to now, so I taught you what the general concept of the storage effect is. It's actually pretty still powerful, but a very simple conceptual way to understand it. Now I want to actually give you a concrete example of how you might actually quantify the storage effect in a real system, because that's what really matters, right? It's a real biological phenomenon. The theory is nice, but can you actually apply it? And to do that, I'm going to use, so we need, and the one thing we didn't talk about in all this, we said, oh, what do we have to do?
You can click on the squares. I think it's the, no, there.
Okay,
yes.
If I knew what to do.
I tried it. I think it's
Clearly not.
no, not this one.
Now it's like, oh wow.
Try the next one.
See? Yes. Success. All right. So we talked about species-specific responses to abiotic environmental variation. But we never actually specified what the environment was, right? What is this abiotic environment? Yeah, it's trying to get me to update this thing like for now, 10 days. Okay, so if you actually want to measure it or to quantify it, you want to know what the environment is, how you would quantify the environment itself. Remember, whether it's favorable or not. It's easy to say favorable, unfavorable, but in reality, then you have to have some metric of how to quantify it. So this is what I want to do today. And so this is what I did yesterday. So I'm going to say, we are going to now look at the mechanistic basis of the storage effect itself, right? I said there's a hierarchy of mechanisms. There's temporal niche partitioning. I've shown you how storage effect can lead to temporal niche partitioning. But the storage effect itself involves all these things, species-specific responses, negative correlation between environmental favorability and interspecific competition, and then there's buffered population growth, right? So to make this concrete, I'm going to look at temperature as the axis of abiotic variation. There are many good reasons for this. All organisms on the planet exhibit some form of temperature variation, whether it's diurnal or seasonal. And although it is the ectotherms, you know, all organisms other than birds and mammals who are directly affected by the environmental temperature, endotherms are also affected through their interactions with resources or natural enemies that happen to be ectothermic. So plants, insects, everything, microbes, everything other than birds and mammals. And also, it's very important for us to understand how perturbations to the organism's typical thermal environment due to climate warming affects their ecological dynamics, and that gives us a basis for predicting how organisms will respond to current levels for warming, and also use that ecological knowledge to then predict how they may adapt to future warming, okay? So how can they respond now without any evolution, which is really what we are concerned about. And the real question is, can they adapt quickly enough to keep pace with the rapid pace of warming, because it's increasing very fast, right? So these are the motivations for studying typical temperature variation first. Now there are quite a few challenges. We already know that there are non-linearities in per capita growth rates arising due to density dependence, right? But we also have organisms, you know, this whole species-specific responses thing. I'm going to make that very concrete. Turns out those responses, especially to temperature, also tend to be nonlinear. So what we then have is we have this interplay between nonlinearities that can make this quite complex. And we want to sort of try to find a way to simplify that complexity through some mathematics, which is why we use mathematics. It can take all this biological complexity, and depending on your talent at translating the biology, you can represent that complexity, the essential elements of that complexity, through a few set of equations, right? And that's what I want to show you. I'm going to show you you can simplify an enormously complex system into 5 measurable parameters, which is pretty amazing given how complicated you will see, okay? And then I'm going to show you an example from my own studies from this insect system where we tested this, okay? Right. So now this is this hierarchy. At the community level, we have temporal niche partitioning. At the species level, we have the storage effect. At the individual level, we have phenotypic traits. What are these? Birth rates, death rates, maturation rates, attack rates, handling times, things like that, okay? And now we are asking, how do temperature effects on these phenotypic traits translate into the species level effect and then ultimately to the community? So that is called a true mechanistic understanding. And to do this, we are actually going to the underlying physiology and sort of the thermodynamical laws that drive how temperature affects things like enzyme kinetics, hormonal and neural regulation, right? We want to really get to the bottom of it. So we actually have everything from biochemistry, physiology, physical chemistry, ecology and evolution, okay? At least just ecology here. But this is the stepping stone or the starting point for looking at evolutionary questions. So the thing is now our goal is to predict the outcomes of temporal niche partitioning via the storage effect based on how temperature variation affects the underlying life history and consumption traits. And life history traits are birth, maturation and mortality. Consumption traits are attack rates and handling times. So I'm going to sort of talk about this underlying biochemical basis very briefly. If you look at any of my papers, there's a lot of this stuff worked out. So we can identify 2 types of processes depending at the biochemical level, depending on how temperature affects the underlying biochemical processes. So we have what are called rate control processes which result from temperature effects on biochemical processes such as reaction kinetics, enzyme kinetics and enzyme inactivation. These give rise to trait responses at the phenotypic level that are monotonic increasing like exponential or left skewed. So mortality and maturation are good examples. So there's a whole thermodynamical basis to deriving these functions, which I will explain briefly later on, but you can also look up because I'm not going to go into all that detail because we just wouldn't have time. And then in contrast to rate control, you have another type of process called a regulatory process, and this operates through negative feedback. So you have rate processes that are increasing and decreasing, and what happens is that there's a negative feedback that pushes those rate processes towards an intermediate optimum. This we understand, right? A lot of times organisms operate at an optimum that maximizes their fitness. So this is distinctive from the rate control where basically temperature drives the reaction to its maximum and then either the organism dies, and then you have this kind of, or temperature keeps increasing until the organism has such high mortality it dies. But the regulatory thing are then it's not working. So they tend to be these unimodal and symmetric responses that can be described by something like a Gaussian, like a normal distribution, okay? And good examples are birth and attack rates. We know about birth and attack rates, right? We've seen a lot of it, but not how they respond to temperature. So here are some examples. So these are the mortality responses of a number of different insect species. You can see that below some threshold it increases monotonically with temperature. These are data for maturation, again for a lot of different insect species, and you can see that this exhibits a left skewed response, just as we said based on And then here are the temperature responses of reproductive traits. For again, these are data for a whole family of hymenopterans. You can see that they exhibit a sort of a more Gaussian regulatory type response. And finally, here we have the temperature responses of attack rates and maximum uptake rates, and they also exhibit a more symmetric unimodal response. Now, the attack rate is a unimodal function of temperature. The maximum uptake rate is actually the inverse of the handling time. So that means the handling time has a U-shaped response. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so what we know from a several large-scale analysis that these trait responses, the qualitative nature of these trait responses, exponentially increasing, left-skewed, or Gaussian, tend to be conserved across different ectotherm taxa. And that's really encouraging. That means we can develop a trait-based framework that can apply broadly for to all multicellular organisms, in fact to unicellular organisms. The difference between unicellular and multicellular is that they don't have a maturation, right? There is no development because there's one cell. In multicellular organisms, they have differentiation, right? So now, the challenge for us is to understand how temperature effects on these phenotypic traits that we can actually measure translate into the dynamics of species interactions. So we need to develop what are called trait-based models of species interactions. So we are going to do this with our favorite example, which we've seen in every context, right? Just non-linear, spatial, temporal. That's the exploitative competition with a dynamic resource. And these equations also you have seen before, where this is where we derive the R-star rule. And remember now, note that I'm using just type 1 functional responses, simply because it's hard enough with type 1 when you put in. Now there's something I want to tell you. So we are going to look at exploitative competition in seasonally varying environments. Now there's something different that you have to get your mind used to. In this, see, these parameters are constant with respect to time, right? The parameters are not varying. But the whole point of having a temperature response is that a parameter is now not constant with respect to temperature, but changes. What's seasonal variation? Seasonal variation is that temperature also changes with time, right? So we have this thing where we could say the temperature itself is a function of t, time, and then let's say there's a trait, say B, birth rate. We say birth rate is a function of temperature, but temperature is a function of time. So the correct way then to write the birth rate would be something like this, okay? So when you see this, don't worry, okay? You'll see a lot of equations getting very complicated because you have all these T of T's, okay? But all that means is now we are moving from the realm of constant environments where the parameters do not change over time. They were changed over space when we did dispersal, but never over time. Changing over space is fine. Changing over time means these equations become non-autonomous. What that means is the outcome is not independent of time. The outcome is always dependent on time. Every model we've looked at, these are autonomous, right? We can solve for an equilibrium that's independent of initial conditions or time. So we get into this realm where it gets tricky. So I want to walk slowly, but I also want you to, once we get to the maths part, just write down your questions because I'm nervous about not being able to finish today, okay? And this is because of that train station problem. But no, honestly, like because I really lost a whole half a lecture. So I want to finish. So write down when we get to the maths part. Honestly, it doesn't matter what these things look like. What matters is what I'm going to tell you, and some of it you will have to take me on faith, but that paper I referred to you does the whole thing, okay? So one of the things, if you have time, is maybe you mathematicians and physicists could get together with the biologists. Maybe when you go to the bar, I don't know, maybe not, but actually try to work together. Like the biologists can ask the mathematicians, what does that include domain? And then the mathematicians and physicists can ask the biologists, what do you think this actually means, right? It's a paper that actually does. That paper was actually, I worked with this student, but that was an undergraduate. If he could do it, any one of you could do it. So don't ever think that you can't do anything like that, okay? You just have to forget that what is integration after all? Is summing, adding on like really, really tiny units, right? So because, do you want to be adding something a million times? No, thanks to Isaac Newton, we have a thing called an integral, right? So it's just a shortcut to adding some things over a really tiny unit, okay? So I'm just kind of telling you. So in seasonally varying environment, the model is going to look like that. It's the exact same model. What's different? Little I is a function of temperature, which is a function of time, right? The only difference is it looks a little more complicated. Now we've written it in terms of time. Everything is in terms of time. So to be correct about this model, we put everything. But is it any different otherwise? No. It's just this. We just add a whole bunch of brackets to show that these things are dependent on temperature, which itself is dependent on time. But that's what we experience every day, right? Winter, summer. So we're just trying to actually put that into our model. Now so the model isn't any different from what we saw before. Resource, consumer, consumer 1 is the resident. So by definition here I'm going to say consumer 1 is the resident species. Consumer 2 is the one coming in and increasing in small numbers. Now the kind of the novel features of this model is that it has mechanistic trait response. There are mechanistic descriptions for all of those trait responses, A, T of T, D, T of T, right? Essentially, this model has how many things? Just attack rates and mortality rates. Conversion efficiencies are temperature independent because they're stoichiometric. That's something that doesn't change, okay? So basically, we have the same model. All we have are attack rates and handling time, mortality rates and conversion efficiency, and then attack rate and mortality rate are now temperature dependent. Not really difficult, except that now we have to put those functions into the model, right? So we do the thing that we always do, mutual invisibility criteria. Now, since things are changing over time, we can't have a single value, right? The per capita growth rate, let's say dx dt 1 over x is changing over time, right? So we actually, since it's seasonal variation, what's the appropriate time unit? 1 year. So we want to take the average over there, right? We can't just look at like summer and say, oh, it's high, because in the winter it's really low. So we want to take the average over that. But imagine adding it 365 times, or if you divided it by an hour, 365 times, 24 times. Do you really want to do that? No. So you could, if you had lots of time, but I'd rather go to the bar. So you could then just take the integral, okay? Now I'm just saying here, we take the time averaged per capita growth rate of the species when rare. The only difference is now we are taking an average over the year, since each day of the year is now different, and we are taking that into account. You're happy with that? Yeah. So if you see an integral, do not worry. That's all we are doing, okay? We're just taking the average over the year. Of course, these equations get a little trickier now. So now look at this. This is the right-hand side. It's the exact same thing. This is the invasion criterion for the invading consumer 2. And there is that quantity R star Cj T of T, which is the Ci, actually, that should be Ci. Wait, no, Cj, because Ci here is, I refers to the invader, okay, J refers to the resident. That's the instantaneous resource availability set by the resident consumer in a seasonally varying environment, because its R star now also changes over time. The R star is not a constant, right? The level to which you deplete resources now depends on the day of the year. Is that true? Because in the winter or in the dead of summer, these species might be different, right? Remember now they are exhibiting, we are going to see like at some point these species to coexist. We already know if this is the storage effect, they must be exhibiting differential responses to temperature, right? So we are setting this up. So just get used to that. That's just the thing you have now seen a million times, but it's now time dependent, okay? So this is really hard. Inside this integral, everything changes over time. So this is really hard. Honestly, you can't actually do this without, for this model, without simulating it. But that's kind of, you know, we are going to, so can we get an analytical approximation? There's a way to do that. So when the consumers exhibit linear functional responses, you know what Jensen's inequality is? Have you heard of this? The mathematicians? Yeah. He was French. For nonlinear functions, f of x bar is not equal to the average of the, for nonlinear functions, the average of the function is not equal to the function of the average, okay? That's kind of fun to say several times, so rapidly in a row. But the point is, if it's linear, then there's no problem. So we're going to use that idea. We're going to say functional responses are linear, and and this is very important, seasonal variation sort of acts like a limit cycle, like it's always the same amplitude, you know. Generally, that's true. You can take seasonal variation, fit a sinusoidal function, and generally that's under those conditions. So this does not apply to warming, because warming is non-stationary, right? The seasonal fluctuations keep changing. So under those conditions, that instantaneous resource availability can be approximated by the regular R star value, you know, D over E A, but with now their temperature dependent response functions, okay? So going back, this is really hard to do because you have to take the integral of the products of those things. You can separate that out, right? You can separate that integral out, but you can't separate the integral A and R star. So you have to get that thing and integrate it, and for the kinds of functions we have, that's impossible to do analytically. So we are going to say, can we somehow simplify that R star, because that's the only kind of difficult thing, and we are doing this, okay? It's an approximation, and you test that approximation, and it works perfectly for seasonal variation, okay? When you have handling times, it gets a bit messy, but for this model, it works absolutely perfectly. Even with handling times, it works, but so now we solve the problem because we know what that is, right? So now we can get something out of this. So before you had to calculate it for each time and put it in, right? Now we are going to say, well, it's represented by this expression. We can just plug into the equation, okay? So this is the only different thing. We plugged in that quantity into the equation. So we now have made an approximation that makes the analysis so much easier. We can get some analytical results, okay? Now, so if you rewrite this thing, the right-hand side, you can write it like this. Because you know that this integral can be separated out, right? We can rewrite this as the integral of this and the integral of this, and you do some rearranging, and you can get this. So basically this is this. Okay? What is 1 over D? If you assume mortality operates exponentially, 1 over D is the longevity, right? What you're doing is then, what is E over A? The birth rate, right? The consumer's birth rate multiplied by its longevity. Sorry, it's its lifetime reproductive success. So we get this really important quantity out of that integral. See what matters, not the little squiggly integral things, right? We can rewrite this as the invader's lifetime reproductive success in a seasonal environment. What is required for persistence or increasing when rare? The lifetime reproductive success has to exceed 1, right? Otherwise, you're going to die. if you don't live long enough to reproduce enough to replace your cell. So it's a really nifty thing that we can rewrite it this way. And then we look at this, we do some algebra, and we can derive what's called the sufficient. Okay, so here is a thing. Remember when I said before, you can have the mutual invisibility is the necessary condition, stability and mutual stability is the sufficient condition. Here mutual invisibility is hard enough that it's got a necessary and a sufficient condition. But in this kind of model, you can show that once it's satisfied, the equilibrium is actually guaranteed to be stable. Okay? So we can derive the sufficient condition by manipulating this thing, and we get this. This is the lifetime reproductive success of the invader. This is the lifetime reproductive success of the resident. In the middle is the R star value of each species in a constant environment evaluated at its optimal temperature. Remember? So we will get to this, but just trust me on that. It just works out if you separate this, and also now remember there are primes on those things, right? So D prime and A prime are just that. So what we do is this actually. We look at this thing. We separate out the temperature independent parts from the temperature dependent parts, because you know the independent parts can be outside the integral, right? It doesn't have to be integrated. What needs to be integrated inside the thing are the temperature dependent parts. So when you play around with this, you end up with the E's and the A's, components of the A's over here, and so basically what we've done is to separate here. Ri T opt is basically that thing with T now A at the attack rate at the optimum temperature. Okay? So that's what's in the middle, that's temperature independent. So we put all the temperature independent things in the middle and the temperature dependent things on the sides. Okay? Now, if I say I drop the hats or the primes, okay? If I say this is a necessary condition for mutual invisibility, how many will say you have no idea what I'm talking about? Go back to this. In order for this entire thing to be satisfied, isn't it necessary first that that be less than this, right? If that is not satisfied, we can go on, right? So it's a nice thing. So we say there is a necessary condition, which is the outer condition, okay? Sufficient is this hard one. So even mutual invisibility has become much harder now. You see why people have trouble with these kinds of things. So what I've actually done here is to, instead of taking Cheson's path, I'm going to show it with a concrete example. See, in a lot of his papers, the theory papers, he doesn't actually talk about the environment and how he quantifies. He does it for different empirical papers. Here I'm going to tell you, here is a real environment. Here's how you quantify that environment. And here's how we get at this, okay? So this is now what we have to, we are going to work with this. You can also rewrite it this way. So, okay, from here to here, you look at this thing, and you want to do something that gets you this. It's exactly the same thing. You know, when you have a product like that, you can kind of go back and forth. And there's a reason why we rewrite it this way, which I will explain to you in a second. So first, let me explain this thing because it really is really important. If both the necessary and the sufficient conditions for mutual invisibility are satisfied, that means the species limit themselves more than they do the other species, and you get stable coexistence. Okay? If it's only the necessary condition is satisfied, this one, then you get one species excludes the other, you get competitive dominance. If neither the necessary nor the sufficient condition is satisfied, you get the outcome depends on initial conditions, and we get priority effects. You know this from basic competition theory, right? There are only three things that can happen. One species excludes the other no matter what the initial conditions are, competitive dominance. You get coexistence if they limit themselves more, or you get priority effects because each species actually exerts a stronger effect on the other, then the outcome depends on initial, kind of like alley effects, right? Right. So what's beautiful about this model is by looking at this, we can look at any system and say that system is not going to exhibit parameters, which is a fantastic thing to be able to say ahead of time by just looking at the trait responses. You never go study, you don't have to do a competition experiment. Have you any idea how hard that is? To doing a competition experiment is really, really hard. So if you have a theory that tells you if you can measure the trait responses, you can predict a priori what can happen and what cannot happen, that's really fantastic, okay? Right. So now here's another absolutely beautiful thing. You know all the alphas in the Lotka-Volterra model, right? You end up getting this alpha 1, 1. So if you actually, I will go through this, okay? I will go through this so you understand it. But it turns out the reason we did it this way, that Daniela and I did this way, is because this is now equivalent to the Lotka-Volterra competition, the mutual invisibility in the Lotka-Volterra framework, right? So what we have done here is to provide a mechanistic description of those elusive alphas that we don't know anything about. All we know is if alpha II is less than 1 and alpha ij is greater, less than 1, whatever, alpha II is less than alpha ij or ji, then there's coexistence. But do we know what alphas are? No. Here's a situation where we can actually now specify those alphas just in terms of attack rates, mortality rates, only in fact because the conversion efficiency is being taken out now, right? This is the outer condition. So we can predict this, we can actually characterize these alphas in terms of the temperature responses of the attack and mortality rates of the resident and the invader. That's a pretty amazing thing, okay? Because this actually hadn't even been done before we worked on this started this in 2016. Hadn't even actually been done. And these equations had existed for over 100 years. So, and we kind of stumbled on it because in a way, like we said, let's do, and then we looked at the integrals and let's just say, and I said one day, hey, that looks like, intra and interspecific competition. So let me explain. The intraspecific competition coefficient is 1 over the average mortality rate over the year. That means it's actually proportional to your longevity. And that makes a lot of sense, right? The longer you live, the more resources you need, and the stronger you interact, your effects on other individuals of your same species. 1 over this thing is the interspecific competition coefficient. Now notice, this is really important. Textbooks always muddy this up. Look at this ratio. This is species 1's intraspecific ratio of species 1's interspecific, like its effect on the other species relative to its effect on itself. That's what you care about. Most textbooks give it the other way. You don't care about this species and that species. You want to know the given species effect on the other species is greater or smaller relative to its effects on itself. And that's what Chesson points out in his 2000 paper, and he says textbooks really muddy the waters, and they actually do. Okay? Because they don't really think about it in a kind of, they think about it in a very phenomenological, we all regurgitate, like, my students in my undergrads used to kind of memorize the whole criteria. I don't know how they did that. Every day I have to rederive everything because I don't remember anything. But they actually memorize these things, and I'm like, wow. Anyway, well, when you're young, you can memorize a lot of things. And so here is one from one species. That species I's effect on itself. This is species I's effect on species J. That's the interspecific competition coefficient, and we've defined them solely in terms of these species trait responses to temperature in terms of attack and mortality rates. Okay? And when we do alphas, we have absolutely no idea, right? We do a Lotka-Volterra model, we keep putting stuff in there until it works. So what we have here is a mechanistic derivation of competition coefficients based on species consumption and mortality rates. So let's look at this intraspecific. So I've already said this. It's proportional, inversely proportional to the species time average mortality rate. It's proportional to this species average longevity over the year. Okay? the interspecific competition coefficient is inversely proportional to this product. It's the invader's consumption rate weighted by the resource availability set by the resident competitor. This is also a really insightful thing. Forget about the mathematics. Think about this. What does competitive ability really mean? There are some resource out there. So its availability matters, right? That's where your competitor might reduce it to a level at which you cannot exploit it, right? That's the sort of the R star thing. But then there's your ability to acquire that resource, right? Do you see that there are two things there? It doesn't matter whether the resource is plentiful if your ability to acquire it is inferior, right? This is like going early and getting a whole bunch of it and coming home, as opposed to one other thing that goes, takes one, comes home, you know. You understand, right? We never think about it like that. But look how beautifully it is illustrated by this thing we have derived is the product of these things. Your resource exploitation ability is the product of how much resource is available, which is a function of the other species traits. Look, this is the function of the residence trait. These are the residence traits, that's the invader's trait, right? Do you see? This is why I think it's really like, it's not even like what we do with this or, you know, or how see how it just falls out by looking at this thing and rearranging it and seeing these connections, okay? And this is one of the best things I ever did, like with, you know, it was so fun with this amazing undergraduate. We would work and I would say, hey, it's like this, and then he would, little thing, he says, well, if you write it this way, then it looks even more clear. And so we worked together on this. He was better than most of the graduate students I'd ever had. So just so very motivated, like he would just go and do these things. I say, how about you do this? And so now mutual invasibility, we can see depends on these two things. Obviously, intraspecific competition, which is for the invader is determined by its mortality rate. Interspecific competition has two components, resource availability set by the resident, which is determined by the resident's attack and mortality rate, and the invader's resource acquisition ability, which is determined by the invader's attack rate. This is all we have to know, right? So we want to now understand how does temperature affect the determinants of invasion success, resource availability, resource consumption, and mortality. Those are fundamental to any organism, right? It's fundamental to any organism on the planet. Right. Yes.
I'm just a little bit confused of what you meant by determinants of invasion success.
Oh, it's not a determinant as in an algebra. It's just it determines.
What determine? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
They actually are the major factors,
The factors
affecting.
that, okay.
Yeah. This is just regular words.
I'm sorry,
yeah.
my mind got
No. That's a very good point. Next time I should fix my slide.
Thank
Okay. Now, here's the temperature response at the mortality rate. So now we want to look at the mechanistic description. So this is the Boltzmann Arrhenius function, where Ti is a reference temperature at which you measure things like room temperature, and pay attention to A sub D, which is the Arrhenius constant, and the Arrhenius constant determines the rate at which that curve increases with temperature, right? So that's your sensitivity to temperature. If that curve is very steep, that species is very sensitive to temperature, right? If it's very shallow, it's not very sensitive to temperature. So what you want to pay attention to is to that parameter, the Arrhenius constant, A sub D, which has units of 1 over temperature in Kelvin. Now we're in the world of Kelvin, okay? Not Celsius, not Fahrenheit. I remember giving a talk in Europe and somebody said, you're very, everybody is equally in trouble because the US people can't understand and the European people can't understand because I always think in Kelvin now, it's so interesting. I would say 298. Oh, I know what 298 is, that's 25 degrees. Anyway, so I live in a world, so because this is thermodynamics, right? So Lord Kelvin. So anyway, here's the temperature response at the consumption rate, and we just use a Gaussian function. I'm sure most people have seen this. So here the important thing is that the optimal temperature at which the attack rate is maximized at 80 opt, and this S of A, the response breadth, which tells you how plastic this trait is, okay, the variability around the mean. Of course, it's very shallow. If SA is large, you're a generalist, thermal generalist. If SA is small, you're a thermal specialist. So keep in mind, okay, these are the only two sort of temperature responses we are really looking at, exponential and Gaussian. Now, it turns out, and you would of course anticipate this, the relative strength of intra and interspecific competition depends on the nature of thermal adaptation. So, cold adapted species, what does that mean? They do better at colder temperatures. So, they have lower thermal optima and they are active at lower temperatures. Warm adapted species have higher thermal optima, they are active at, like us, at higher temperatures, right? Thermal, then there's another aspect to thermal adaptation. Thermal specialists have narrower response breadths, and so they're active during a narrower temperature range. Generalists, on the other hand, have wider response breadth, active during a wider temperature range. That's like us surviving when we go to Minnesota or Wisconsin, or not surviving. Anyway, so let's first look at the effect of thermal adaptation on intraspecific competition. Now remember, self-limitation or intraspecific competition strength is inversely proportional to the average mortality rate, right? That's the average mortality rate, time average mortality rate. Everybody happy? Please pay attention. Just pay attention. So that everybody agrees with that, right? It's 1 over that. And then mortality response looks like that. Now we can work out what the differential responses are. That's the curve, but where do you fall on it, right? Depending on your thermal adaptation. So here are the mortality responses for a cold adapted species and a warm adapted species. You have these notes, so just pay attention. You can see anytime a curve is concave up, the arithmetic average is above if the Jensen's inequality actually applies, right? Concave up means the average of the function is higher than the function evaluated at the average. So what that means is the cold adapted species has lower average mortality compared to the warm adapted species because it's occupying that part of the curve. So you see how beautiful? We are actually explaining species specific responses to temperature variation. And so what that means is lower average mortality because it's 1 over that, that's the strength of intraspecific competition. Lower average mortality means cold adapted species actually experience stronger self-limitation compared to warm adapted species, just by virtue of the fact that the warm adapted species are always on the higher end of the mortality curve. Look, that's in Kelvin, okay? So in temperatures in Kelvin. Yes, Miguel?
Yeah, I didn't visualize this.
Sorry?
I couldn't visualize what you just said.
So look at the graph. That's the range of temperatures over which the cold adapted species is active. On average, that's pretty low because it's on the low end of the curve. The warm adapted, so sorry, I actually didn't explain that. The gray area is where that species is active. So the warm adapted species is active in that high temperature range because the curve is exponential, and that's a fundamental fact of life. In all ectotherms, no matter what it is, mortality rate increases with temperature. It's simply biochemistry and thermodynamics. We do not argue with the laws of thermodynamics. That's the one thing we do not argue with. It hasn't changed in however many 200 years, right? So you have weaker self-limitation. See how we are now actually explicitly defining species-specific responses to temperature variation. It's no longer an abstraction, right? This is exactly what it is for tropical and temperate species, for example. So interspecific competition, remember, has two things. Resource availability is set by the resident, which is a function of the resident's consumption and mortality rate, and its the invader's resource acquisition ability, which is the invader's consumption rate. We already know this is a Gaussian, right? The attack rate is a Gaussian. Now, how do we work that out? Because that has A over D. So, A is a Gaussian divided by a D, that's an exponential. We need to see the multiplicative effect of that. And so, we now need to actually work out what the R star looks like. That's R star, right? But temperature, what does the temperature dependent R star look like? It's a non-linear, so it's a multiplicative effect of this and this thing and this thing. You divide this thing by this thing. So, yeah, I got ahead of myself. So, you have, that's mortality, this is attack rate, right? And how does that work out? It looks like this. And it's nothing like the other two. So, look at that. That's the temperature response of the R star. And in fact, it can actually go up a little bit here as well. When it gets very cold, we leave this realm of Arrhenius temperature enzyme kinetics and you enter a different realm of freezing of body fluids. If your body fluids freeze, are you reproducing or attacking anything? No. So, we don't actually, we are only considering the biologically relevant viable time, okay. So, but it looks like that. What it means is, does it mean? Strength of competition, R star is lowest at intermediate temperatures, gets higher at extremes, interspecific competition is strongest at intermediate temperatures, becomes weaker, which makes sense, right? When it's very cold or very hot, you're not doing anything, you're going to die soon. So, now, let's look at the R stars. So, here we have that curve. Where do cold adapted species are active at lower temperatures? They have on average lower R stars, right? Just like the mortality thing. Warm adapted species actually occupy that part of the curve. They have higher R stars. Do you agree? On average, that's, yeah. It's not resource availability, I've written something wrong there. Yeah.
It looks a little bit weird because we have high temperature, we expect to have a really high mortality, and if we are taking the ratio between the attack rate and the mortality.
So yeah, but see, this is low and this is high, so it will be high. Yeah,
okay,
right?
okay.
I mean, you can work it out. I've actually done that. So, and in fact, yeah. So so think about it. Either way, it's small, and in the middle gets goes down because this is high and this is low, right? So, sorry, yeah, it's the other way. This is, just do the exponential by a Gaussian and you will see. Like, so wait, you're not multiplying, you're dividing, okay? So it's 1 over, so basically it's like if you're multiplying, it would look like the negative exponential, okay? All right, so then, oh, no, trust me on that, curve is correct. So, so you basically have the same thing as the mortality rate in a way, lower resource availability, the lower R stars in cold adapted species, they depress the resource to low level. It's a weird thing, right? You think, oh gosh, those must be, we always think warm adapted species are superior. But this is how, like we actually learn how things work. And warm adapted species have higher R stars. So what this means is something very important. Cold adapted species experience stronger self-limitation than their warm adapted counterparts. They also deplete the resource to lower levels, meaning they have lower R stars than do their warm adapted competitors. Now, that's about thermal optima, right? Remember, we have optima and response breadth. Any plastic response has some sort of an optima and a response breadth. Now, let's look at differential adaptation to thermal. These are environments in terms of response breadth. So, if you are a thermal specialist, you're active over a narrow range of temperatures no matter where you are. So you have lower average mortality and stronger self-limitation. Because remember, anything concave up, the more you experience it, the higher your average is, okay? So I think the physicists and mathematicians should really teach others about Jensen's inequality, you know, when you kind of talk about this. I mean, it's such a simple, mostly I think it's the fault of the instructors that they don't actually talk about this in biology, like ecology lectures. So I just go through this and I give people papers, and it's such a fundamental thing to know, okay? But see, so then thermogeneres, because they are active over longer periods of time, higher average. So see how beautiful this is. Like you see, actually, thermal specialists, which is completely counterintuitive, actually can experience stronger self-limitation. And in the same way, a thermal specialist, because it's active over a small range of temperatures, will have a lower R star than a thermal generalist. It depletes the resource to a lower level than thermal generalist. So this actually upends our conventional wisdom about generalists and specialists when you come to thermal adaptation. So again, just to summarize, thermal specialists limit themselves more than their generalist counterparts. They deplete the resource to summarize. So now, species that exert, so here's the mechanistic basis of the storage effect in temporary environments. We saw, what we see is that species that can exert strong interspecific competition because they have lower R stars. For example, cold adapted species or thermal specialists are also the ones more self-limited than those who exert only weak interspecific competition. That's actually a criterion for stable coexistence. That's what it should be exactly. If you are a strong competitor on another species, the only way it can compete with coexist with a weaker competitor is if your effect on yourself is stronger than your effect on the other species, right? Because if one species is stronger, there's an asymmetry, right? So one species is stronger, there's an asymmetry because the other species is at a disadvantage, overall disadvantage. So it experiences, so the strong competitor experiences a very strong negative effect on the other species. The only way they can coexist is if the strong competitor exists and stronger effect on itself. But it makes sense, right? If you're a strong competitor, then it would make sense that you would have that competitive effect on any other individual who's trying to take the resource away from you. But this is the condition. This has to be satisfied. You know, as you know, there are certain alpha things that have to be satisfied for coexistence to occur, and it boils down to the alpha i's being smaller than the alpha ij's or ji's. We are getting to that through an explicit mechanism. There's really no arguing with this. This is what the temperature responses are telling us. We are not making this up. And those temperature responses are what we observe, as you saw from the data I showed you. Okay. Now, we can now, with this knowledge, try to develop some testable predictions that we can go and actually test on real species. But to do this, we have to connect these trait responses with the temperature regime, right? Like, remember, all that stuff we found out was by saying, okay, the cold adapted species is in this part of the thermal regime, the warm, and then that means we have to connect, in order to test this, we have to express these trait response parameters in terms of the thermal environment. Now, so to do this, we go look at the empirical observations. There is one thing that's always commonly observed is that the difference between the thermal optimum for a given species, the physiologically optimal temperature, and the mean habitat temperature increases with increasing latitude. So here are data from a tropical and a temperate insect species. You can see that in the tropical species, TH is the mean habitat temperature, T opt is the optimal temperature. They're exactly coincident. But that makes a lot of sense, right? Because in the tropics, it doesn't fluctuate very much. the optimal thing to do is to be at the mean habitat temperature, right? Because the mean is what you experience all the time. But if you look at a temperate species, the mean habitat temperature is much lower than the optimum. Why? Why is the mean habitat temperature? We know that already. It's because they fluctuate a lot. But why would the optimum exceed the mean? Because you want to take advantage of the favorable parts of the year, which is warmer, right? If you were here, any mutant with a higher optimum is going to exclude you. So they've evolved optima that greatly exceed the mean habitat temperature, which is driven by the fluctuations in the environment, but they are adapted to take advantage of the favorable time periods of the year, which is the summer or spring and summer. A second empirical observation is that the response breadth increases with increasing latitude as an adaptation to withstand larger fluctuations. That's sort of a no-brainer, right? So here is a tropical and temperate species. You can see that the response, tropical species tend to be thermal specialists, temperate species by necessity have to be thermal generalists. And you can see beautifully that they stay in the near the optimum. And this shaded region is the seasonal regime experienced by the species. We also see from the data that species differ in their temperature sensitivity of mortality. So here are the mortality curves for temperate, Mediterranean and a tropical species. The shaded region is the seasonal regime they experience. You can see they are all exponential, but the temperature sensitivity of mortality, the Arrhenius constant, changes, right? So these two are very steep relative to the temperate species, which actually makes sense. If you live in a very seasonal environment, your curve should be as flat as possible, right? Now, so we want to use those empirical observations to scale the optima. So we have something called T-opt, right? But how do we connect that to the actual thermal environment? We do this by, so let's say let MT denote the mean habitat temperature and AT the amplitude of seasonal fluctuations. So MT is the mean habitat temperature, AT is the amplitude, okay? Then we say, so consumer 1, let's say, is the resident species and consumer 2 is the invader. Then the resident species optimal temperature for its attack consumption rate, we could say is MT plus M, right? Because it's not going to be the same as the mean, where M is the deviation of the consumption optimum from the mean habitat temperature. Now, we know for tropical species, M is all near 0, and for temperate species, M is going to be a larger positive value. And then we do the invader's consumption rate, T opt A2 is equal to T opt A1, that plus some X, where X is the deviation of the invader's consumption optimum from the resident. Now, we have actually defined species specific responses to the environmental variation in terms of the environment itself. From the, using the mean, in fact, we are just using the mean here, right? The fluctuations come, will come later. Then we say the response breadths, we are going to scale them. We are going to say let V be the response ratio of response breadths of the invader and the resident. And that tells you the relative degree of specialization and generalization. And AD1 is the resident consumer's Arrhenius constant for increasing in mortality. And then we say let P be this ratio where the invader is always on top. So that tells you the relative temperature sensitivity of mortality of the two species. So now what we do is we take those relationships, we substitute them into this equation, then we did a flood of algebra for many days, and then we compared, and one of us had missed an X, the other one had mixed Y, and then we worked it out, and we got this. That looks bad, right? The important thing though is it's a mechanistic description of the mutual invasibility criteria consisting entirely of measurable parameters. S of t is the seasonal variation. Okay? So we sat down, we tried to simplify it, and you can measure every single one of these. And that's the beauty of it. And if you actually look at it, there are only 5 parameters to measure. How great is that? I'm not saying this because this is our paper. From all that complexity, you could boil it down to 5 parameters, 2 of which are just the temperature regime. Anybody can. You can download the data from NOAA or somewhere. MT and AT, and you need only 3 things. Differences between the consumer species in their thermal optima, response breadth, and temperature sensitivity of mortality. Those 3 things, X, V, and P. Okay? So, what we see is something really new here, which is that density independent mortality, which drives intraspecific competition. Whoever thought that that would be true, right? We never thought that that could be important, but in a temporally variable environment where the axis of variation is temperature, how long you live is everything, okay? Is crucial to coexistence. So, density independent mortality, the temperature response of density independent mortality is absolutely crucial to coexistence in thermally variable environment. And this trait-based model provides a mechanism for species-specific temperature responses to temperature variation. In this case, the temperature sensitivity of mortality, where P gives the ratio of those sensitivities for the invader and the resident. Right. So here is something we can predict a priori. That's the nice thing about this. We could predict that mutual invasibility will be possible if the cold adapted species, which has a lower thermal optimum, experiences greater temperature sensitivity of mortality, steeper mortality curve. Why? If you have a lower thermal optimum, you are a stronger competitor on the other species because you have a lower R star, right? So you have to give the other species a break, so to speak. But if your mortality rate increases very steeply, like this, it's very low where you're active, but when you go out of your favorable period, you have a huge disadvantage that helps the warm adapted species, right? So that reduces its effect on the warm adapted species. Do you see? It's just biology, but it's just really amazing, right? If you have a temperature sensitivity to mortality, your mortality curve is such that you actually get very strong, because it's very low means very strong intraspecific competition, right? But the problem is now you're going to have a very strong effect on the other species, but since your mortality is really high when the environment is favorable to your competitor, your effect, interspecific effect of competition is weaker than the intraspecific effect. Okay? So, we are going to say that cold adapted species should have a steeper mortality curve and a lower attack rate at higher temperatures. Warm adapted species should have a shallower mortality curve and a higher attack rate at higher temperatures, okay? Which is true though, right? Because if the temperature responses are such that if you look at this, the optimum for the cold adapted species is lower, right? So its attack rate is higher at a lower temperature. So this is the kind of thing where you have to go home, look at that paper and kind of reflect on this, but it's actually a really significant set of findings, okay? So here in words, steeper mortality curve means lower mortality at lower temperatures and stronger self-limitation during the favorable time for its species. Now do you remember the whole storage effect thing? You should be mostly self-limited when the environment is favorable to you. And the steeper mortality curve actually gets you. So you have very low mortality when it's favorable to you, very high mortality is unfavorable to you, which helps the other species because this is favorable to the other species, this is unfavorable to that species, right, your competitor. So favorable for the cold adapted species is the colder parts of the year. Steeper mortality curve also means higher mortality at higher temperatures. This combined with this lower attack rate at higher temperatures increases the cold adapted species R star at high temperatures, right? then that leads to weaker competition on the warm adapted species when the thermal environment is favorable to the warm adapted species. Do you see this? Right? It all came from those temperature responses that are actually their adaptations to the thermal environment. That part is we cannot argue with. Those came from the data, but if we take that, then we say, let's put it to an ecological model, let's see what happens, and we get all these insights. Now, so lower attack rate optimum and a greater temperature sensitivity mortality then works on the other side, right? On the at the cold spectrum, that means it is going to limit. So just these same traits that make its impact less strong on its competitor will help it during its own favorable period to exert stronger competitive effects on the conspecifics, individuals of other species, right? So if you have a steeper mortality curve, that means during the cold period, you have very, very low mortality. So since intraspecific competition is inversely proportional to average mortality, then you're going to have a very strong self-limitation effect at the time that's favorable to you. And you're going to do really crummily at the time that's favorable to the other species. So you're not going to, even though you're overall a superior competitor, the time difference makes it. And then you do not have the warm adapted species, which is very non-intuitive, is on in the main actually more disadvantaged because it has a higher R star. Not even the R star is just very, very high mortality, this is really true. Tropical species on average actually have. That is why an increase in the mean temperature is highly, highly detrimental to tropical species. They're all already at the edge of their tolerance. Anything more, and you know, you've seen these studies that predict that tropical species are going to be more susceptible to extinction by climate warming. We see it, but that's because they're right at the edge, right? There's nowhere to go. They're just like they're at the mean. The mean increases even by 0.5 degrees. You're going to be in that decreasing realm. All right. So for the warm adapted species, the shallower mortality curve means lower mortality at higher temperatures. Oh, okay. For the warm adapted species, it looks like that, right? So then it has lower mortality at higher temperatures, and lower mortality means stronger self-limitation for that species during the time that's favorable to itself. Okay? It's never as high as this one, but all you need is for it to be sufficiently strong relative to the interspecific effect, which we now know is weaker because the cold adapted species doesn't do well here. Okay? Right. So the shallower mortality curve also means higher mortality at lower temperatures. This combined with this lower attack rate at lower temperatures increases the warm adapted species R star, leading to weak competition on the cold adapted species when the environment is favorable to the cold adapted species. So it's a mirror image of the other, right? So the warm adapted species does really well in the warm conditions, favorable time, but during the cold period it does really, really badly. So just like the cold adapted species has lower strength of competition on the warm adapted species during the warm period, the warm adapted species has a weaker effect on the cold adapted species during the cold period, which satisfies the requirement for the storage effect, that each species is more limited by itself, intraspecific competition during the time that's favorable to it, and it experiences relatively weak interspecific competition during the time it's unfavorable, right? Okay. So higher attack rate optimum and lower temperature sensitivity, warm adapted species limits itself more. The condition for coexistence is that each species limits itself more than it limits the other species. But the interesting, really important thing is the thermal adaptation leads to this negative covariance, right? Favorable environment, low interspecific competition, right? Isn't that the negative correlation? The higher the favorability of the environment, lower the strength of competition. So if you had this thing, if you were to plot the optima or the response breadths with the strength of competition, you would see this negative relationship. And again, it comes from the underlying thermal adaptation. So I showed you this, so now we are in a situation where we can actually test this. So here's something. When the cold-adapted, this comes from the mathematics, so you're going to have to trust me on this. When cold-adapted species are more sensitive to temperature effects on, like, you know, it has a higher sensitivity to mortality, the necessary condition is always met. But why? Because if it's very, very strongly self-limited, then it's going to have a less of a strong effect on its competitor, right? Because the curve to be like this means that you're actually going to be penalized at this end. This curve being really steep means you actually it's beneficial here. There's an antagonistic effect on this, right? So we can, I told you that with this model we can predict a priori whether you will get priority effects. If that's true, then priority effects are not possible because the necessary condition is always satisfied. Okay? And when the opposite is true, you can actually get priority effects. So we can get with these trace-based invasibility criteria, and this is done in the paper, you can predict the conditions for coexistence, competitive dominance, and priority effects in thermally varying environments. Now, testing predictions, and I want to very quickly do this to show you how you can actually test this. So it's not some esoteric set of predictions. And these are data from this insect host parasitoid system I've been studying for a long time. So here the host insect is this thing called the harlequin bug. It's a hemipteran bug that feeds on a native plant species. Its eggs are attacked by two species of parasitoids. They're Hymeropteran wasps. One is Trisochus morgantiae and the other one is Oencertus johnsoni. They compete for host eggs, but in this system, Oencertus can parasitize eggs that have already been parasitized by Trisochus, and when there are two larvae inside the host egg, the larva of this species kills the larva of that species. So we actually have exploitative competition and intragame parasitism. So they actually engage in a trophic interaction as well as exploitative competition. We are going to ask the question, if there were no intragame parasitism, could they coexist through differential responses to temperature variation? So this question has been a puzzle. This is something I started studying when I was a graduate student. It's very puzzling. In the lab, if you look at this, if you actually do competition experiments in the lab, Oencertus, the intragame parasite, excludes Trisochus, the intragame prey, within a single generation, all the time. In the field, the two species have coexisted for over several decades, and you can see that they're partitioning. There's some element of temporal partitioning. Trisochus is more cold adapted. I'm going to call it IG prey because it's easier. It's more cold adapted. It comes in early. Oencertus, the IG predator, is more warm adapted. You can see when that comes in, that species goes down. And so you can see this element of temporal partitioning. Now, if you measure these parameters, so we did this. In the lab, we measured the temperature responses of attack and mortality rates. And we also measured the conversion efficiency. It seems, so when we do this, the V is the ratio of the response breadths. It's very similar, it's 0.98, so very close to 1, right? Not very different from 1. But they differ in their attack rate optima, but that X, there is a deviation of 1.04 degrees, which is actually pretty significant. And the temperature sensitivity of mortality. So they actually, the species, so here, so those values don't mean much to you, but the species with the lower attack rate optimum, which is the IG prey, exhibits greater temperature sensitivity of mortality. Now, if you go back, that's what we predicted. No, where was it? Here. Are more sensitive to temperatures, effects on density than the height. So, That means the necessary conditions should always be satisfied. This system should not exhibit priority effects, and that is very true. In these experiments, no matter what the densities we start them out with, outcome is always, in a constant environment, competitive exclusion. So here's a real life example of R star, right? So that's the necessary condition. Now here we have plotted that condition for the data for this species. So the solid curve is the left hand side, this thing, okay? And the green curve is the line one, you know, the right hand side, the boundary, right? So you can see that, and this is the difference in attack rate optima x, that thing we were measuring, and this is the relative strength of inter and intraspecific competition, and this is the response spread. And the dashed line is where the actual parameters fall. You can see that the necessary condition is always satisfied for both temperature optima and the response spread, okay? You see that because it's below the green line, right? It's actually really interesting. We're actually seeing this in the real system, right? Then the sufficient condition. Sufficient condition is that you have to look at the middle part, the ratio of R stars at the optimum temperature. Now here, below the red, I have to actually look at my notes. Below the red line, I think it's the red line. No, below the black line, only Trisocus is present. Above the black line, Trisocus is excluded. And above the red line, only O insertus is present, okay? Below the black line, only Trisocus is present. Above the red line, only O insertus is present. That gray area is coexistence. This is as a function of optima. This is as a function of response spread. And the dashed lines are showing you where there's no difference. Okay, x is 0, v is equal to 1. And remember the actual v was 0.98, so it's very close. And you can see the blue dot here is the mean response that we see for x. And the error bars show the variability in the outcome around that optimum. And you see the error bars are asymmetric. That's interesting, right? That's because these things act multiplicatively. So the error bars are not symmetric around it's only when it's additive. Okay, that's another interesting thing. Now what we see is that it's right at the boundary, right? It's right at the boundary of where, if you look at the mean, it's right at the boundary of where O insertus is winning. So what we then did was we asked the question, but there's a lot of variability around that outcome. If we were to sample that variability space, what's the frequency at with which they could coexist within that range of variability? So what we did was we did 10,000 random runs of sampling of these parameters within the real parameter space to construct that histogram. And you can see the solid line is the mean outcome. So if you look at the mean responses, that's the outcome. This dashed area, this area is where coexistence occurs. And you can see it's just outside to the disadvantage of the IG prey, right? That's what we saw. But if you look at the distribution, it's actually within the range of variability. So it's not coexisting through just this mechanism. But if Trisocus were a little bit to adapt a little bit, to be a little bit different, then coexistence is possible, right? It's a kind of an interesting thing because I almost felt like if we found coexistence, that would be kind of boring because we kind of know that there's something else going on, right? In the system, we have integral predation, parasitism. But what is interesting is that there's only a very small difference in terms of these ratios of R stars. So if there has been enough time for Trisocus to adapt to this system, then that might actually change. These data are from 2009. We actually measured them in 2021, and I am pretty sure if we went back and saw this, this would be now different because now they're getting more adapted to a warmer thermal regime. And here's the beautiful thing. Here is the temporal dynamics of this system as predicted by our model using the parameter values where you get coexistence. So, from this region, if you take the parameter values from this region and you look at it looks like that. Trisocus comes in, goes down when O-insertus comes in. These are the real values from the field for the two species. And you can see that's a remarkably similar pattern. It actually captures, of course, it's not all true, but look, the important signatures are there, right? O-insertus actually has a larger peak. Trisocus doesn't. And the way they go down is almost the same, right? So that's an amazing thing just from using the trait responses. We didn't use time series of abundances. We didn't use any of those in the model. All we used were the temperature responses we measured in the lab, and we get this pretty remarkable congruence. The model is actually able to predict the outcome you see in the field. Now, so what we've done is, to summarize, we've been looking at exploitative competition in seasonally varying environments. We derive mutual inversibility criteria in terms of mechanistic descriptions of trait responses to temperature. And here are the key insights. This is true for everything, not my insect system. This is universally true. The exponential nature of the mortality response causes the self-limitation strength to decrease with increasing temperature, right? Because the more mortality you suffer, the shorter the time you live, the less strongly you can limit your conspecifics. Cold adapted species and thermal specialists experience stronger intraspecific species competition than warm adapted species and thermal generalists. You cannot argue with that because the temperature response of mortality is the temperature response of mortality. It's what the species exhibit, and it's true for lots of different species. The exponential nature of the mortality response always also translate into, remember, the reason why the R star looks like this is because mortality looks like this. The exponential nature of the mortality response translates into lower R star and so stronger interspecific competitions as temperatures below the attack rate optimum. Let's say the attack rate optimum is here. Competition is stronger below it than above it because this is asymmetric. Okay? This is why cold adapted species are stronger interspecific competitors, and that comes from the empirically observed temperature responses. So, thermal adaptation is such that cold adapted species and thermal specialists exert weaker competition on warm adapted species and thermal generalists when the environment is favorable to the warm adapted species and thermal generalists, and you can switch that and say that again, and then it will be true for the others. Like you see that they are adapted in such a way, it's a pretty remarkable thing, right? They are adapted in such a way that they tend to limit themselves more than they limit other species. And that is coming not from my insects, that's from the fundamental nature of these responses, the data of which I showed you at the beginning for a lot of different species. And there are more data, I just don't have the time to show you all the data. There are hundreds of. So here we have the mechanistic basis of the storage effect. So we've actually elucidated the mechanistic basic in terms of temperature effects on the life history, traits, mortality rate, and consumption rate. And we can see that the species-specific responses arise from temperature effects on these underlying biochemical processes like enzyme kinetics, enzyme denaturation, hormonal, neural, and hormonal regulation that lead to negative feedback. And these trait effects translate into, that's the beauty of it, these trait effects then scale up to translate at the level of the individual relative strengths of intra versus interspecific competition at the population level. And we can then, the most powerful thing about this is that we can make testable predictions about population level patterns of coexistence based solely on trait response data. Only these responses measured at the individual level and completely independently of any population level information. We don't have to use time series. So it's very powerful, right? You do this, and then just as we did, then you go look at the time series, you predict the time series from the model, you compare it with the observed time series. It's much more powerful than looking at the time series trying to work backwards. You're never going to get here, right? You can't look at a time series and say, well, thermodynamics made this happen. You can't. So this is why this approach is really powerful. Okay? And I believe that's it, and I've finished, my goodness, on the dot. All right. Okay, so I was actually going to say this at the end, but Flavia was thanking me at the beginning, but so that ends my lectures and my time here. And I actually have to say it has truly, I sincerely mean this has been an absolute pleasure teaching you. And oh, I have to, I should have written it down somewhere. So I hope you've learned something. It's a lot, but the notes are there, and someday, hopefully, it will become useful. And this is my email address. If you want to talk, ask questions, talk about your research, about grad schools, it's just my last name and my first initial at Gmail. I'm sure this is somewhere, but okay. So I'll see you still like around because I'll be back for the seminar, Fernando's seminar. But it's really been wonderful. I hope you had a good time as well. Although being on the other side of a lot of complex lectures isn't always fun. You know, really, I wish you the very best, and I think you're really brilliant. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And if you want any help, I'm always there. Okay? All right.